The Detroit Lions are facing a devastating loss after week six's matchup in Dallas, despite going in to the Cowboys Stadium, defeating them 47 to 9, taking out all of their frustration from a season ago. Despite having 5 defensive takeaways and 47 offensive points, the Detroit Lions cannot walk out of Arlington with their heads held high, as it feels that even though they won, even though they improved to 4-1 on the season, they lost more in that game than they earned. And that, of course, is due to the fact that the Detroit Lions have now lost their best defensive player to an injury. Aiden Hutchinson, in the second quarter of that game, lost the rest of his season due to a fractured tibia bone. He broke his leg on a sack when he was tackling Dak Prescott. He swung around, his leg made contact with the Lee McNeil shin, and it was a gruesome injury. It will cost Aiden Hutchinson likely the remainder of his 2024 campaign. And it was an excellent campaign, a campaign that was going to see him potentially get his first Defensive Player of the Year nod, potentially his first All-Pro vote, and potentially see him as one of the premier defenders in all of football. Now, of course, losing a player like that is devastating to any team, and especially a Detroit Lions team that is already without Derek Barnes, that is already without Marcus Davenport. The Lions' defensive line is now stretched incredibly thin. And today, we're going to talk about the impact that the rest of the defensive line can have on this team, as well as a couple of options that the Detroit Lions might look to explore in order to replace Aiden Hutchinson, a player that could come in and be that premier pass rusher in the absence of Aiden Hutchinson's lost season, and potentially be a player that can be put alongside Aiden Hutchinson to start the 2025 season. So, with that being said, let's get into Aiden Hutchinson's injury, his time to recover, as well as some of the replacement options the Lions could be looking into. Now, Aiden Hutchinson was on pace for a historic season. In 5 games, Hutchinson had 19 tackles, 17 quarterback hits, 7 tackles for loss, and led the NFL in sacks. He still currently leads the NFL in sacks with 7.5, as well as a singular forced fumble. Not only did Aiden Hutchinson lead the NFL in sacks, but he also leads the NFL in pressures, as well as leading the NFL in pass rushing win rate. He was one of, if not the best defensive linemen in the NFL. And as I said, as of today, or at least as of the before his injury, he was the favorite for Defensive Player of the Year and likely would have gotten an All-Pro nod. Now, Aiden Hutchinson's injury is, of course, awful for the Detroit Lions. He broke his tibia. It was a clean break, and the recovery time, from what I could see, was 7 to 8 months, putting his return at sometime in the month of June, right before training camp and OTAs, meaning he should likely be healthy for the start of the 2025 season. And I do not claim to be a doctor. I don't claim to know the medical research behind the recovery for a broken tibia. And I have heard a lot of things. I have heard that if the tibia break was clean and it was just the tibia bone after immediate surgery, Aiden Hutchinson could potentially be healed within 2 to 3 months, putting his return sometime in late January, if not early February, if the Detroit Lions go on a Super Bowl run. I have also heard that if it was a little bit more complicated of a break, this could be upwards of a 10 to 12-month recovery. However, from most of the sources that I have read, most of the people claiming to be knowledgeable on this subject, they place his recovery time somewhere between 7 and 8 months for a full recovery, meaning his 2024 season is officially over, and there's very little likelihood that he will be returning. Now, the Detroit Lions put out just a few minutes ago on their social medias that Aiden Hutchinson is out of surgery, that the surgery went very well, and that Aiden Hutchinson is expected to make a full and complete recovery. That is fantastic news. That means that the fibula was not fractured or broken, which is really, really good for Aiden Hutchinson's sake. It means that there was no nerve damage. It means it was not a compound fracture. It was a clean break, which obviously is not good for Aiden Hutchinson, but the fact that it was a clean break and not a compound fracture or, bone shards being splintered or anything like that means that the recovery process will not be quite as long as it could be. And that is one of those best case scenarios in a situation like this that potentially means Aiden Hutchinson could be healthy as early as 5 to 6 months if recovery all goes according to plan. Now, the most similar injury that I could find to this to compare to Aiden Hutchinson's is one that J.J. Watt suffered in the 2017 season on October 10th, meaning that in the same week, just 3 days apart, they suffered nearly the exact same injury. Right on October 10th of 2017, in Week 5 versus the Kansas City Chiefs, J.J. Watt did the same thing. He broke his tibia and he did not return for the season. He missed the remainder of 2017, but it was nearly the same thing. It was the same leg, it was the same bone, it was broken just 3 days apart on the same week of the NFL season. And of course, we know J.J. Watt did not return that season. He only played 5 games for the Texans, did not record a sack that season. But I bring this up because in 2018, J.J. Watt did return to the Texans. And J.J. Watt played in all 16 games, as well as going through training camp, OTAs, and the whole process. He had 25 quarterback hits, 18 tackles for loss, 16 sacks, 7 forced fumbles, and a first-team All-Pro nod. That is the kind of player and the kind of play that Aiden Hutchinson could return to. Meaning, despite the injury to his leg, it should not complicate his career. It should not impact his career too heavily, apart from, of course, missing the time he will miss this season. But when he comes back, much like J.J. Watt, he should be okay and should be able to play at just as high of a level as he was at through his 2024 campaign. Now, with that being said, let's take a look at the rest of this Lions roster. The defensive depth is looking quite thin. After losing Derek Barnes and John Kaminsky, Marcus Davenport, and now Aiden Hutchinson, all to season-ending injuries, the Detroit Lions edge rushing room is looking quite thin. With Isaac Ukwu making his NFL debut a day ago, I thought he looked pretty good. I counted 3 or 4 pressures as well as a quarterback hit, but of course did not record a sack. The undrafted rookie free agent out of Ole Miss. James Houston has been a flashy player for several years for the Detroit Lions, but this season, after putting on a bit of weight, spending some time in the offseason trying to fill that Sam linebacker role, really just doesn't seem to have the bend or the juice that he had even last year in the NFC Championship game. Josh Paschal is a player that has been super underrated for this Detroit Lions defensive line for many years at this point. And while I think he's a very good run stopper, he will keep the run defense at an elite level. He's not the same pass rusher that Aiden Hutchinson was. And really nobody is, right? Nobody on this roster, not Trevor Nowaske, not Josh Paschal, not James Houston, not Isaac Ukwu. None of them will bring the pass rushing juice that Aiden Hutchinson does. None of them will command the double team like Hutchinson did. None of them will be nearly as explosive, nearly as impactful, nearly as devastating to an offense as number 97 was. With that being said, I still think that the Detroit Lions will be okay as a pass rushing front. On the interior, they still have Aleem McNeil, who had 2 sacks in Dallas. They still have DJ Reader. They still have Levi Onwuzurike. They still have Mekhi Wingo. So that interior pass rush, I still think, has quite a bit of juice to impact the quarterback and get some sacks, pressures, and errant throws. The edge rushing group is hurting. They certainly are. But Trevor Nowaske recorded his first career sack in Dallas. We know how good James Houston can be. I think this is a great opportunity for Josh Paschal to step up. I think this is a great opportunity for Isaac Ukwu to get some reps and get some good work in. And I do think that this Lions defensive line will still be an elite run defending line, but I think they'll still be able to get some pressures and get some sacks. Will it be nearly the level that it was before? Probably not. Right? Losing a guy like Aiden Hutchinson is never going to help your defense. But Aaron Glenn has showed in the past that when the pass rush cannot get home, he gets very creative with blitzes. He gets very creative with sending linebackers. And I do think that Aaron Glenn has been in this type of situation before where the front four probably won't get it done by themselves. So they'll send Anzalone or they'll send Jalen Reeves-Maybin. And I do think that he will be creative enough to put the defense in situations to get to the quarterback. And even without Aiden Hutchinson yesterday, the Detroit Lions defense still recorded 2 sacks after he was taken off the field, as well as recording 3 turnovers after Aiden Hutchinson was carted away. Now, with that being said, I do think the Lions should make a trade. I do think Brad Holmes should be on the phone this morning talking to certain teams about certain pass rushers to try to bring in and replace the impact that AIDAN Hutchinson had for this defense. In a very similar way that the Bears traded for Montez Sweat a season ago, I think the Lions could make a very similar move for a defense that is in desperate need of an alpha pass rusher. Now, the popular names are, of course, Max Crosby, Hassan Reddick, Josh Hines Allen, I have seen a few times over and over, as well as Harold Landry from Tennessee, and my personal favorite, Trey Hendrickson from Cincinnati. Starting off with Max Crosby, he is, of course, an elite player. He has been one of the NFL's best defensive linemen over the last couple of years. And after a couple of choice words in the Raiders' loss to the Pittsburgh Steelers, as well as a couple of choice actions, it seems as though the relationship between Crosby and the Raiders has been fractured. Now, Max Crosby would likely cost the Detroit Lions at least a first-round pick, if not multiple first or high-round selections, as well as over $25 million a year against the cap, as he is signed through 2026. This would bite into the Detroit Lions cap space quite significantly over the next 3 seasons, of course, this year, next year, and the year after. And with all of the players that the Lions have to sign coming up, including Levi Onwuzurike, Aleem McNeil, Derek Barnes, Kirby Joseph, and then, of course, you look forward to Jameson Williams and Aidan Hutchinson and Brian Branch and Jahmyr Gibbs and all of these players in the future. It is hard to justify paying Max Crosby $25 million a year when you know you're going to have to pay Aidan Hutchinson probably close to $30 million a year or two down the road. This is something that the Detroit Lions, I think, can consider, but I think it might be a little bit too expensive for Brad Holmes' taste. Another very popular option is Hassan Reddick. This one doesn't make sense to me. I truly do not understand the fascination with Hassan Reddick, a player that was traded this offseason and refuses to play for the team that he was traded to. He wants a massive extension at 31. He is a poor culture fit. He is an older player. He will be incredibly expensive and probably be a massive headache for the Detroit Lions. This is the least likely option I see for the Detroit Lions. He does not seem to fit the culture. He does not defend the run very well. And while he is a great pass rusher, this is not the type of player you want to trade for. This is not the type of player that they should have traded for. And I think if they could go back in time, the New York Jets would not have made that trade. If they knew what Hassan Reddick was going to be, they would not have traded him because he will not play without a contract. He has proven that time and time again. He is a selfish player, for lack of a better term. He wants his money. He's not going to play until he gets it. This does not make any sense, and Hassan Reddick is the least likely option of any player in the NFL to be traded to Detroit. Now, Josh Hines Allen is, I think, a very interesting option for the Detroit Lions. The Jaguars are 1-5. They are likely to fire their head coach within the coming weeks, and despite having just 2.5 sacks to start the season, Hines Allen recorded 17.5 in 2023. Now, he will be relatively expensive. I believe he is 28 years old at this point in time. He is a little bit on the older side, but certainly not to the point where you would have to worry about his age. He is very expensive, upwards of that, $25 to $30 million range at any given season. And I do think he will probably cost a second, if not a first-round pick to move on from Jacksonville. However, if Jacksonville continues to lose by the trade deadline, if they have just 1 or 2 wins by the trade deadline, and they're looking to move on, they're looking to rebuild, their head coach has been fired, the general manager could potentially take a second-round selection for Hines Allen, move on from an expensive and a pricey contract, get a high pick relatively within the NFL draft, and decide that that is worth moving on from. But again, then you face the same problems with Max Crosby, a player that will help you immediately, will help you within the next 2 years. But at that point, will it sacrifice your ability to re-sign Aleem McNeil, to re-sign Derek Barnes, to re-sign Kirby Joseph, to re-sign Aidan Hutchinson and Jameson Williams and Brian Branch and so on and so forth down the line? And I think that that is a true concern that the Detroit Lions have to take account for. Harold Landry is a very similar way. He's under contract through 2026, so he's not as long-term of a commitment as some of these other guys, but he is still very expensive, just under $24 million every year for the next 3 years through 2026. He does have a connection through the Detroit Lions defensive line coach with Williams, who was with Tennessee a season ago, where Landry saw his most impressive seasons. As of right now in the 2024 season, Landry has 4 sacks, 8 quarterback hits, and 6 tackles for loss. The Titans are 1-4 with a brand new coaching staff, and if they keep losing similar to Jacksonville, it might not take nearly as much for Harold Landry to come over as it would for Hines Allen. However, my favorite choice for the Detroit Lions is Eric Hendrickson, a player that is a little bit older. He's 30 years old right now. He'll be 32 by the time his contract is up, but he is still playing at an incredibly high level. Last season, he recorded 17 sacks for Cincinnati. This season, through 5 games, he already has 5 sacks, 10 quarterback hits, and 5 tackles for loss. The Cincinnati Bengals are 2-4 after their primetime win versus the New York Giants last night, but if they keep losing, if they struggle towards the trade deadline, if in 2 to 3 weeks they are 2-6, 2-7, or even 3-5, they could be sellers at the deadline. A team that definitely needs a little bit more work put in to get back to the playoffs and get back to the Super Bowl. A team that could use the draft capital at this point could be a team that's looking to move on from their 30-year-old pass rusher. The Detroit Lions, if they keep winning, if they are, let's say, 7-2, even 6-3 at the trade deadline, you could make a case that Trey Hendrickson makes a lot of sense. Not only that, Trey Hendrickson is signed through 2026, but his cap hit is only going to max out at about $15 million. Next season, it goes up, I believe, closer to 20 or 25, but that is just a singular year, and it goes back down to about 12 in 2026. Or the Detroit Lions, after 2025, can cut him, freeing up that $12.5 million with zero dead cap money associated with it. This is a player that will help the Detroit Lions immediately in 2024, could replace AIDAN Hutchinson, or at least replace a large amount of the production that AIDAN Hutchinson would bring you. He's a player that would be around for 2025 if the Detroit Lions decided to keep him, but he's not a player that would financially impact the Detroit Lions beyond that if they needed to get rid of him. If in 2026, the Detroit Lions, Kirby Joseph contract starts to get expensive, and Penei Sewell's contract gets expensive, and Goff and Brown and all of these other players are starting to make some massive money, you can clear up nearly $13 million by getting rid of Trey Hendrickson after getting 2 really strong years out of him. And unlike a player like Max Crosby, unlike a player like Hines Allen that might cost you a first or a second round selection, I think Trey Hendrickson could very easily be moved for a 4th and a 6th, or a 4th round pick and a depth player on the Detroit Lions roster. I do not think the value for Trey Hendrickson would be any more than what the Falcons just spent on Matthew Judon, and they spent a 3rd round selection. So it wouldn't be nearly as expensive for an older pass rusher that financially is very workable with what the Detroit Lions have in their short and long-term goals. And he'd still be a player that by 32 is probably still putting up 10, 11 sacks with a healthy scratch record of being on the field, a healthy record of not being injured. And then, of course, in 2025, pairing that with AIDAN Hutchinson and having pretty easily the best defensive line in football. A defensive line of AIDAN Hutchinson, Aleem McNeil, DJ Reader, and Trey Hendrickson would be phenomenal for the Detroit Lions, quite frankly. I think this is their best option to not only win now, but potentially put together a super team for 2025. With that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. The injury to AIDAN Hutchinson was severe. It was gruesome, it was tragic, and it is an awful story for the Detroit Lions 2024 season. But that does not mean hope is lost. That does not mean the Detroit Lions are done for the season. I still very much believe they can go on a playoff run. I still very much believe they can compete to win this division. And I still very much believe that they can win the Super Bowl with their roster. Let me know down in the comments below what you think about the AIDAN Hutchinson injury, how it impacts the defense, as well as what players you would like to see the Detroit Lions call and make a trade for. If I talked about them in this video, tell me what you think about the trade and what it would cost. If I didn't talk about them in this video, bring up other options. If there's another defensive lineman, another edge rusher out there that you think is a possible trade target, leave it down in the comments below. I'm very curious to your guys' opinions. With that being said, that is all for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. If you've yet to subscribe to the channel, please go down below and do so. It helps the channel out a ton. But with that being said, thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.